for the funds that invest in distressed assets. If you invest in distressed assets, you can invest in the assets themselves, the equity of the assets. We can also invest in the debt issued against those assets as well. So here's a little fine line between what we invest in. We call them private equity funds. But private equity funds, another way to think about it is that they're not funds that invest in private equities. Because I'm going to show you later what private equity here literally means. Private equity funds is a fund that is registered as a private equity enterprise. It's a privately owned fund that invests in many things, but they also tend to invest in private companies too. So sometimes there's a overlap between, is it about the private businesses that we invest in, or is it how we structure? So here's a little hint that says they don't just invest in equity, because you can also invest in debt if you like. Private equity funds literally invest in anything that they can get their hands on. So you might want to invest in distressed debt because you think the debt you can buy is attractive. Okay, the price is attractive. Imagine, okay, suppose you see a country that issues a lot of government debt, and the country says, you know what, I'm not going to pay anything back to you. I'm just going to default on your debt, because I realize that a lot of people who buy my debt, buy my sovereign debt, you guys are all foreign people. So screw you, I'm not going to pay you. I'm going to stop payments. And if you were lending money to those countries, you'd be very upset, because they're going to stop payment. That means it's going to be worth nothing. So if somebody is willing to buy this from you at a price, at least it's not zero, right? Maybe the price you used to buy was 100. Somebody is willing to buy from you at maybe 5 or 10 on full value 100. You're happy because the country just said, I'm not going to pay anything back to you at all. Getting something back is better than getting from nothing back at all. But you are the private equity fund. You go and buy up all those debt for pennies on dollars, and then you turn back to that country and said, by the way, you said you're not going to pay me back, right? No, you can't do that, because I'm going to sue you. I'm going to take you to court so that you end up paying me instead. So that's an example of distressed debt investment. You buy up pieces of papers which other people think are worthless. Then you try and squeeze money out of that and make them pay. So there was a case about private equity funds that invest in distressed debt of Argentina. And Argentina at one point said, I'm not going to pay anything back from you, screw you. So those funds went out and buy up all those debt, and then ended up taking Argentina to world court. And then they won. So that's how we can make money. Buy things for pennies on the dollars, and then make them pay up more. There are also people who go up and buy a lot of NPLs, right? Small people who default on their loan. So banks sell off those loans because they can't be bothered to collect on that debt anymore. So they're going to write off those loans, sell them at a haircut, and then these funds go and buy up all the claims, and then went after the debtor to make them pay up their claims in full. So that's another type of investment you can do. So instead of buying the company and turn it around, there are people who don't turn the company around but actually end up forcing the owners to pay more. But let me show you why private equity investments, sometimes how they got the name private equity from. Because private equity investments are structured as funds, but funds that are owned by a limited number of people. So that fund is a private equity vehicle in its own right. Only a few people own that investment vehicle. Let's see. Here's a few analogies I wrote on the board, right? Fund, firm, LPs, GPs, and portcos. Let me explain to you what they mean. If you're working at a private equity firm, these firms are firms that manage those funds. So when you talk about PE firm, you talk about the investment managers. So the firms who set up funds, right? And then the funds is going to have investment from two groups of people. We call them LPs and GPs. LP stands for limited partner, and GP stands for general partner. And the reason we call them partners is because a fund is actually a partnership. It is set up as a partnership, not a corporation. Okay, so we have different types of partners. Limited partners are people who only provide the money. So they can be like pension funds, insurance companies, anyone who has a lot of money, wealthy individuals, sovereign wealth office, government agencies, or drug dealers and so on, whoever. Put the money in, and then the private equity fund manager will manage the fund on their behalf. But if you manage fund on somebody else's behalf, then you run into the issue of, can I make sure that you invest in things that really create value? So back to the Leland and Powell kind of asymmetric information, like, are our incentives aligned or not? If you are managing my money, but you don't have any skin in the game in my money, how can I trust you? So typically, investment managers who invest their money into those funds as well. And when you make that investments, those guys are referred to as general partners. Because these are now partners who put the money in and are also responsible for day-to-day operation of the fund. They are responsible for deploying the capital. So we call these GPs. Typically, GPs are then, GPs used to be investment bankers or fund managers themselves who became very wealthy. So they will invest part of their own wealth in those funds as well as a show of faith to investors that, hey, I'm putting my money, okay, where my mouth is, so you can believe every word I say, because if I make a bad investment, my wealth goes down as well. So it's a trust signaling mechanism. And then suppose you set up a fund, then a fund is going to invest in companies, and those companies, we call them portfolio companies or portcos. So when we talk about companies, we talk about companies we invest in. And there can be many, many deals, many portfolio companies that we have. If we invest in buyout private equity, each fund may have, say, 4 or 5 portfolio companies, because each company can be pretty big. If you are a venture capital fund, then each fund may invest in 50 to 100 portfolio companies. Make very small investments. You may have heard of the name 500 Startup. Okay? In Thailand, there's a partnership with 500 Startup called 500 Tuk Tuk. So it's like a franchise agreement where they give you the funds, and then we have local partners who invest the funds on their behalf. 500 Startup is also it's a venture capital fund and also a startup incubator. So they help your business develop and also find markets. Their strategy is very simple. One of the partners said, if you want to make a lot of money, then instead of making committed investments in something which you find very well, just make a lot of small investments. If you make a lot of small investments, assuming that the types of portfolio companies that come to you tend to be high quality companies anyway, one of them is going to get lucky. And when they get lucky, you get lucky too. So invest a small amount spread across many portfolio companies. That's one strategy, right? Other people may have a more hands-on approach where they focus their investments and then they go and then work with the companies they invest in. One of the hallmarks of investments like this, unlike mutual fund management, is that when you're a mutual fund manager, you own shares in companies too, but when you own them, you own like 2%, you own like 5%. You own a lot, you own enough so that you can talk to management, but you can't force management to change their way of thinking. But when you invest in deals like this, for buyout companies, you completely buy them out. So the company is now actually under your direct control. You do whatever you want with that company. When you invest in venture capital companies, you tend to invest enough so that you have a board seat on that company to make influences to that company too. So they don't just sit back and put their money at work. They also provide the management expertise, advice, and also connections and so on, so that you can help either grow the business or turn around the business. So it's a very active form of investment, very active because you also end up managing the companies too. Sometimes the GPs don't run the company themselves, but they'll have a say in appointing who runs the company. So if you want to see more about how specifically the venture capitals and also startups work, there's a series on HBO called Silicon Valley, okay, that follows some of the things that happen in Silicon Valley, but taken to the extreme and very comical way. But a lot of the things that they present in that series is very reflective of a life of what a startup company does and also venture capital company does. And then you see that venture capital companies who take a very active role in determining the direction of the companies. Sometimes they even make introductions for you to meet with other businesses to create new business ideas and so on. Okay. Down here, there's a little note that says average fees on private equity fund is 2% annual management fees and 20% performance fee. Let me elaborate a little bit about what that means. Okay. When you invest your money in your mutual funds, there's a little line that they report to you called the expense ratio. That's how much they're charging you for managing the funds. And the fees is calculated based on the asset under management. So the larger the asset under management, 2% per year of the amount that you're managing. So if you're managing $1 billion of capital, you are getting 20 million management fees per year just for holding on to that capital, not doing much. So we talked a little earlier about fundraising concern. Fundraising is concerned because if you're managing funds, these funds typically have a limited life because you need to return the capital to regional investors. So you have to think about at any given point in time, how much asset under management do I have? And the more asset under management that I have, the more fees I get to charge. So that's the management fee typically set around 2%. So let me write down the first number, 2. Another number is 20. 220. This is a very common compensation structure for fund management, not just for private equity funds, but for hedge funds as well. So 2% here refers to the management fees that you charge on the asset under management, like I explained earlier. But 20% here is the profit sharing agreement. So if you are GP, if you're a fund manager, you get compensated based on number 1, the size of the investments that you are managing, and number 2, the performance of the investments you're managing. So if you make a good return on the investment, you get to share in the profit of that investment. So suppose your portfolio company generates some returns, maybe $1 million in that year. You're going to take 20% of that million as GP. Then the other 80% of that million would then be allocated toward the LPs. So very asymmetric returns. As LP, you're not getting the proportionate share of your capital. But then you're happy with that because typically private equity returns tend to be higher than stock market returns. So paying them more in terms of proportion, but in terms of the takeaway pay in your pocket, the LPs are still pretty happy because they're getting more returns than they were getting otherwise in the alternative investments. So this is a 220 classical structure. 2% management fees and 20% profit sharing agreement.
Yeah.
Yes.
2% management fee. Are they going to take it? How are they going to take it based on?
Out of fund. Suppose I raise $1 billion or $1 billion of capital. I'm going to take 20 million this year, so the fund capital goes down to 980. Next year I take another 2%, so the capital goes down to 960.
Oh, so they take it at the end of the year.
Yeah, they take it every year based on the committed capital amount. So if I ask everyone to chip in 1 billion, I get to charge 2% on 1 billion every year. So the amount of capital left in the fund to be invested has to be, you have to deduct the fees out of that first. Very similar thing when you invest in mutual funds, because when you see what the net asset value of the fund is, that's the amount after they take away the management fees. So when the investment generates return, your fund value goes up. But continuously, the fund managers are also taking money out as expense at managing managing the funds on behalf of you as well. So as you can see, the incentive, okay, if you only have a 2% fee, the incentive is pretty weird in the sense that no matter the performance of the fund, as long as the fund size is big, I get paid a lot. Not related on return at all. So there's no direct mechanism for this. So for mutual funds in Thailand, the mechanism that we do this is by redemption and also subscription. If we see that the fund doesn't have very good returns, then we withdraw. No, we would like to think that we withdraw the fund and then invest in another fund that has better returns instead. Right? So there's a lot of research that shows in the world that if you look at mutual fund returns and the fund flow, there's a very strong positive relationship between the mutual fund flow in this year versus the return in the previous period. People look at fund returns and they see that if the fund has been doing very well, I'm going to put my money into that fund instead, and vice versa. So that's a very indirect way, okay, of disciplining the incentives of fund management. And so they structure this 20% here as a way to make sure that investment managers are really incentivized to generate returns for the investors, because they do take the upside of the investment as well. This 20% profit sharing is called carried interest. That's a reason why they call it carried interest, and there's also a reason why they call this they do a partnership. Because when you do a partnership, this carried interest is paid as the additional value to the partnership. This carried interest is classified as a capital gain. If you pay the managers as income, it's classified as ordinary income. And income tax rate in the United States for very wealthy people is very high. If you relabel your income as capital gains tax is flat at 20% no matter how wealthy you are. So they actually structured this in a partnership because it saves them on a tax payment. So there's a legal, historical reason why they structure them as partnerships and why we have LPs and GPs. In fact, LPs and GPs are referred to any investment management vehicle at all. You know, it doesn't have to be just private equity. When you look at hedge funds, okay, I talked to you guys about Billion series earlier. Hedge funds compensation is also a 220 compensation, and they're also structured as a partnership. Each fund you raise is a new partnership, so it's like a new entity that you have, you know, different shareholders, different partners in there. So I think it's this part, okay, it's this structuring this as a private entity part that people call this private equity fund, because there are only a few people who can put money in there. Whereas a mutual fund is like this too, but there are many people who can put the money in there. So it's more like a public money as opposed to private money. Okay, but either way, okay, definitions aside, that's what they do. They invest in the types of investments not familiar to people who only have access to mutual funds. Some other words you might want to be aware of. So we see LP, GPs, and portcos. So GPs tend to be very important, and if you are in fund management, you want to work your way to become GPs. You may start off as fund managers, fund associates, and so on, but once you have enough money, you become GPs, so you also put your capital at work as well. When you have investment, you go and raise funds. People promise to give you money, but they haven't yet. And you don't want that money yet, because if you take that money, you don't know what to do with it. One of the problems, okay, with having money committed and not using the money is that if I am a pension fund, I promise to give you money, 100 million. 5 years on, you've only called 50 million. I still have 50 million uninvested. I'm going to be pretty angry because I reserved some capital for you to use, but you never came around and asked to use it. I could have used that money to do something else, but I was waiting for you. So I get very upset if you don't call the capital according to schedule. In fact, if you're a fund manager and you have a lot of dry powder left, that is not good. Because when you have dry powder, too much dry powder means you haven't used up the money. And if you haven't used up the money, it's a negative signal on your ability as a fund manager. On the other hand, you may want to reserve some dry powder, because when you make acquisitions, when you do a buyout, you might want to do what's called a bolt-on acquisition. We saw that word in the case as well. A bolt-on acquisition basically means you make other smaller acquisitions into the original company you acquired so that it becomes more valuable, can offer more stuff, or become a better company in general. So you can think of this as like accessories you add on to your main company to make them better. So sometimes you might want to reserve some capital to make these investments as opportunities come along as well. Think of the argument why someone might need to have excess cash in the portfolio, because just in case the opportunity arises, you want to be able to jump on that investment opportunity. But on the other hand, when you have too much cash on hand, okay, just like how Apple has been asked historically to let go of that cash, because if you have too much cash on hand, you're not using it, why the hell are you keeping it? You should give it back to me. So same thing, right? It's a balance between having too much dry powder and too little dry powder. Drawdown and paid in capital. Again, okay, drawdown. In this case, unlike mutual fund drawdown, it's different meaning. Okay, mutual fund drawdown, I learned, means the amount of the maximum percentage that the fund can drop down in value from. But a drawdown in this means a capital call. A drawdown means you committed 100 million, right? How much have you drawn? Have you drawn 20? Have you drawn 40? How much left? It's still undrawn. So that's a drawdown. The drawdown then becomes a paid-in capital to the fund and gets invested. When you look at investment, you also want to look at vintage years. Yes? A bolt-on? Okay, suppose I am a social network company, okay, and I decide that, okay, video messaging is a thing and I want to have augmented reality filters so that when you take videos, my face can become a dog. But I don't have this technology. So I go and acquire a company that has this technology and integrate it into my own social network. That's like a bolt-on acquisition. That it augments your current core business so that it becomes a better product. Yeah. Yes, think of these as things you add on to your company so that you have a better offering, so that in the end, when you have to exit eventually, you have a more favorable valuation of your company. Lastly, vintage year. When you look at these funds, you also want to look at vintage years because it means when that fund was raised. Sometimes the performance of the fund depends on when the fund was raised as well, because when the fund was raised also means when the fund was investing. We're going to see later, capital market conditions sometimes can affect the business of private equity a little bit. So when you evaluate the funds, you should compare the funds that begin at the same point of time, because funds have finite starting point, well-defined starting point, and typically a finite life is going to go on. So we want to know, okay, at which stage is fund in, and also when was that fund raised. Management fees we talked about, but in terms of the carried interest, how we pay the money, okay, the carried interest works like a distribution waterfall. Again, the waterfall concept means when you have the water coming along, you divide the water up, you allocate the water up asymmetrically. You may reward some people before, some people after. You may reward some people more, some people less. Typically, when we look at common shares in a company, we look at cash flow in a company, a waterfall of a company is a debt cascade, and then the common equity. So you pay down all your debt, the rest goes to equity. But for private equity, within the equity cascade, you divide many types of equity as well. There's not just one type anymore. There are types of equity that get paid before, types of equity that get paid less, types of equity that get paid asymmetrically more, and types of equity that get paid asymmetrically less. We're going to see this, okay, a spreadsheet of this waterfall together next time, so we can see how this is calculated. So, 20% profit sharing means I make a profit of $1 million, okay? I'm going to take 20, you take 80. And this may be asymmetric in terms of capital call, because remember we had GPs and LPs. So we put money into the fund. But GPs tend to put in a fewer amount of money than LPs. So I could put in 5% of the capital. You put in 95. But when it comes to profit sharing, I take 20, you take 80. So that sounds a little unfair. So in order for the carried interest to begin to kick in, sometimes you may want to set a hurdle rate. But the hurdle rate here is not like the hurdle rate in investment evaluation. Hurdle rate here is literally the hurdle that you must jump over before you get paid. So, okay, so it's conceptually a different kind of hurdle. Think of it as like the minimum rate you need to clear in order for this carried interest structure to set in. So, I may ask, the fund must deliver at least 8% return to everyone first before you get your carried interest. So that means, remember we had a 90 95.5 in terms of capital committed. But in terms of the profit that we're going to get, as long as I don't make 8% return, 0 to 8%, you as GP, you get nothing. But LPs get 100% of the portfolio return. So if I don't make investments that get less than if I don't beat 8%, I have 0 carried interest. I don't get paid this, I only get paid a 2% fee. The 20% carried interest doesn't kick in. But once you clear 8% returns, then we're now 80-20. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the, do I have this? I may have taken it out. Okay, a few slides on, I have a structure okay, that show you. Now, this is a little difficult to visualize at first. Okay, when we look at return, the payoff, think of them as not percentage. Think of them as the cash flow you allocate to different people. So on the x-axis, we have the cash flow that the fund receives. From the perspective of the GPs, until you meet the preferred return, another name for the hurdle rate here is a preferred return. Until you beat the minimum cash flow you're supposed to provide to your GPs, you don't get anything. You don't get anything at all. Once we clear this, then the money can be split 80-20, but not yet. There may be a catch up. Okay, so here's a tricky part. The catch up here simply states from 0 to X, where you are delivering preferred return to LPs, all the cash flow goes to LPs. So that's the 100% that we're allocating. But once we clear this, I'm going to allow you to, once we clear this, I'm going to allow you as GP to start catching up. So now the next type of fund, the next return is going to go to you too. So we're going to have a different phase here, where we have a catch-up period. And this catch-up period, I can say it's 100% to GP and 0% to LP. So this would be this yellow line here. Okay, so we're switching. If I have a net preferred returns, all the cash flow goes to you, my customer. Once I met my minimum return, then I stop paying you. The next dollar flows to me. 100% catch up means everything goes to me. 100 for you, 0. 50% catch up means once I clear the preferred return, then we split 50-50. Okay, so once we split 50-50, the rest, once we clear all the split, then we go back to 80-20 sharing. Okay, so this is a little difficult when we have the catch-up period, but sometimes funds do this. And as you can visualize here, okay, if you have a fast catch-up, then as GPs, you're going to have a more incentive to really, try to ramp up the return. If you have a slow catch-up, then you may be lingering around here more. So that's the catch-up phase. Once we stop the catch-up phase and we go to carried interest phase, where we do the 80-20 split afterward. There's also a way that we allocate the cash flow, allocate the returns. If you go back to the picture earlier, one company can invest in one fund can invest in multiple companies. So, do I want to split the returns on a deal-by-deal basis? Or do I want to split returns on a fund basis? Pool all the cash flow in the fund and then calculate the waterfall structure. Or do I want to do the waterfall structure on a fund-by-fund basis? And again, we have a European versus American analogy of options. The European is going to be more lenient here, I guess. it's done on a global basis. So we pool all the deal cash flow together at a fund level and then calculate the payoff structure. Whereas the American culture is to evaluate each deal you're making. I'm going to give you the money on a deal basis. So if this deal you lose money, you don't get anything. That deal you make a lot of money, you get a lot on that deal. Okay, so this one allows for more diversification within the companies that you make. This one is more extreme because it forces you to be very successful on every single investment that you make. So it's a little more stressful for people making the investments. Finally, a clawback clause. Sometimes you clear all those rates. Yes, but you do it on an interim basis. Okay. But if you don't deliver, what do? Can you make up for the losses suffered? If there's no clawback clause, you can't claw back the you can't guarantee performance. If you have a clawback clause, what it says is if you fail to make returns as promised, then the fees that I gave you, I am gonna take back the fees I gave you. I can claw back. Okay, that clawback simply means I'm gonna take back. So the word clawback is used in many other contexts too. Sometimes we have a stock option clawback. And there was a case, you guys may still remember the company called Singa. You might not know the company, but I think you know the names of the products the company offers. Farmville, Mafia Wars, Words with Friends. So those are the games that this company, Singa, either made or bought and sold. Okay? So I forgot who the CEO name is already, but he was very successful. Okay? Around about 8 years ago, every finance magazine covered him as a successful guy. Few years after, the company tanked because they weren't able to find new products, and there were competition, and also kind of Facebook stopped promoting Farmville on the page because people got really annoyed about all the game invitations. So one day Facebook said, enough of that, I'm gonna shut that from all the feed. So the company didn't do very well after that. So the company gave the CEO, I think his name is Pincus, right? Mark Pincus, right? Yeah. The company gave Mark Pincus a lot of stock options in the beginning. In the end though, the company clawed back all those options because they blame it on him that he mismanaged the company. So clawback is a term used to basically snatch something back that you gave away. Typically, those don't really happen, right? But it's not like they are outlaw, can be done, but under very extreme circumstances. So sometimes funds may have a clawback clause, especially young funds that is beginning to start off to convince investors that we stand by our performance. If things don't turn out very well, we're going to make you whole. I'm going to allow you to claw back the fees. So it's a lot about signaling game because in the end, you're selling the credibility to your investors. The structure here, the 220 structure here is kind of designed to give that signaling to your investor too that, hey, you're paying me short, but I am guaranteeing you some preferred returns. And I'm also participating in the upside. So see, I have a very strong incentive to make sure the fund return is very high. Unlike mutual fund compensation where it's more on a flat 2% basis, this one is very well aligned with the investors. So it's been very popular. So here are some statistics about the amount called up and amount distributed. So in the past, okay, and around these years, we had a lot of funds that being raised, but more recently, the funds have been raised already and now beginning to be returned. And you may rightly guess, okay, people don't put the money in those funds anymore. What they're doing after 2008, that's been a big wake-up call about actively managed funds. So actively managed funds are funds that you give them the money and then they select the investments for you. We call them smart money. Okay? On the backdrop, there's also something called dumb money. Means you put the investment in, you don't need to think, nobody needs to think because dumb money just tracks the stock index. And the cheapest way to do that is called exchange traded funds, ETFs. can read more on this and look at how they are actually different from mutual funds. They're all their funds, but the way they are structured and the way they operated are completely different from mutual funds. But the point is, they're supposed to track index returns. Until 2008, people were putting faith in actively managed funds. But from the financial crisis, first comes the lack of trust. The eroded trust in financial system. And number two, evidence began to emerge that if you put your money in actively managed funds, mutual funds, or even smart funds, hedge funds, or private equity funds like this, turns out you're not actually beating the market very much or at all, pre-fees. And the fees can be pretty high for management like this. So why the hell should you pay them to manage money for you? Why not just automate your investment through index tracking funds? And if you look at the statistics of fund flows from actively managed funds to dumb money, the ETFs, you see a net outflow from actively managed money into ETF funds. That coincides with a study by a few professors in Journal of Finance that talk and look at the performance of funds in the stock market. It turns out mutual funds don't outperform the market significantly either around 2008. So there's been an outflow of funds from the smart money to dumb money, and that's the hot area nowadays. So remind me to give you the link to podcast on exactly this issue. Okay. And that's reflective of this trend here too. There's an outflow of the funds here into the, they don't say where the funds go, but my guess is that they go toward the index tracking funds because, hey, this is cheaper. Get same returns, but cheaper management fees. If you pay 2% fees per year, that's a lot when you add up over 5 years or 10 years. In terms of fund types that's being raised, still, buyout fund is still the most popular. One of the things this number tells you is that buyout funds tend to be pretty big because the dark line here is a number of funds, and the light line here, the light bar here, is the amount of fund raised. 209 billion spread over 184 funds. Whereas, venture capital, number of funds by far the most. We probably heard about this many times over. VC is a hot thing. But when they do raise funds, though, each fund is a lot smaller compared to private equity funds. So each fund can be like 100 million. Recently, we saw many different businesses raising funds to invest in startups. Even Jones Lang LaSalle is raising funds to invest in startups. Visa and MasterCard also have their funds to invest in startups. But most of the time, the number is about $100 million. Sounds like a lot, but you look at those private equity buyout funds, the funds can sometimes be like $3 billion. So a whole new scale altogether. Because these funds are large enough to buy out companies like Kraft, Burger King, the rental car company Hertz. Those are all targets of buyouts. So they tend to buy very big established companies. In Thailand, we had a few of those cases too. Buyout companies in Thailand. We'll talk more about that later, about what kind of companies they invest in. And that's the number of funds in the market. So buyout funds, so on average, you can see here the fund size about 1 billion. Venture cap, by far the most number of funds active in the market right now. As we know, it's a hot thing to be in. Also other types. There are also fund of funds. I think part of that also, they're ignoring the hedge funds in here. So that's separate together. So we talk about the firms. Who are the firms? You may have seen some of these names before. Like Silver Lake, for example, you may have heard of this company. Some of these companies invest in, most of these companies are well known for investing in big companies, buyout funds, but they're now also beginning to blur the line. They also have dedicated funds that invest in startups as well. Silver Lake, for example, used to invest in Skype. Some of these guys, I'm not sure which one, used to invest in Facebook as well. There are also funds that specialize in those early stage companies, but these guys also go into those spaces as well. 3G Capital. Heard of this? 3G Capital? This company is actually the owner of Burger King Global. I think it's a Brazilian buyout company. MBK Partners, not our MBK. It's actually a Korean MBK. I'm not sure what that stands for, but I'm pretty sure it's Korean name. Thailand, though, the two buyout funds in Thailand that people more well known, people know more about are Lombard and Lakeshore Capital. If you're interested in working private equity, my friend is actually a partner at this company and he's recruiting, so we can talk about this later. The kind of company Lakeshore Capital has been investing in, Santa Fe Steakhouse, is owned by Lakeshore Capital. What else do they have? Panpuri is now also owned by Lakeshore Capital. Humanica, that just recently IPO, is also owned by Lakeshore Capital. So that's examples of kind of investments and what they do afterward, right? So in the end, they need to get their money back, and IPO is the most popular way because it's you're selling to the open market. There are more buyers. So if the conditions are right, you get more money. Otherwise, you can sell to other people. Sometimes buyout funds sell to other buyout funds too. We call this a portfolio flipping. And the reason why they have to sell is because when you raise a fund like this, a fund has a limited mandate, typically 5 to 7 years. After 5 to 7 years, a buyout fund needs to return money to the investor. Then they can go back and ask for money again. But they have to commit to give the money back because the investors need the money back. So when they do need the money but they can't exit their investment, sometimes they sell their investment to other funds in order to at least get that capital back to return to the investor. Here's an example of some of the names, and then you can see here, right? Top names are like KKR, Carlyle Group. KKR is very well known for their attempted takeover of Nabisco, like RJR Nabisco, the one that makes a Ritz cracker and many other things. So there's even a case written about them. I think it's called, the movie is called Barbarians at the Gate, if I recall correctly. It's a case where KKR tries to buy RJR Nabisco and then they fought back. And they fought back by famously using self-harm strategy. You're gonna buy me, right? You're gonna buy me using lots of debt? Sure, I can take lots of debt too. So I'm gonna do a recap, take on lots of debt, and if you still wanna buy me, fine. So that's how they defended against the takeover. Make yourself highly levered, so you're not a very attractive target anymore. What kind of people invest in private equity? Well, we know it has to be people with a lot of money because we saw the numbers earlier. That's a lot of capital being tied up in private equity. Almost many $1 trillion invest across a multiple asset class. So where do you find money from? Well, who has money? In most countries, pension funds, especially public pension funds, because they get the money regardless of what happens. By law, you're required to give them money. So their asset size grows as long as your population base grows. And they also need to find generate return to give back to the investors. But it's patient capital, because think about when you pay into the pension money, you pay as soon as you start working. But when do you take out? When you retire. That's a long, long time. So if you want a definition of patient capital, pension fund is the most patient capital available on earth, because on average, the duration of portfolio, duration liability is actually very long that you have to pay out. Then you have other people like insurance companies, also long. Private sector pension funds too, that's a voluntary part. Sovereign wealth funds. So those are people like Temasek. Sometimes companies have a lot of money, countries have a lot of money and they don't know what to do. So we can invest those money in order to generate more returns. I see a lot of argument about whether countries should do that in the first place, right? Especially central banks. There was at one point, a few people were trying to say, the Central Bank of Thailand has a lot of capital on the balance sheet right now, but it's being invested in bonds, not yielding very much. So why not use that capital to invest in private equity funds or even businesses like this to generate more returns? So it's a matter of philosophical issue about what you want to do with the money. Central bank money is kind of a dangerous, because central bank money is there because they print money. The central bank money is there because they want to stabilize the currency. But government money, on the other hand, right? Sometimes you have a surplus of it. So instead of giving it back to the giving back to the citizens, you might want to invest it instead. So, so Saudi Arabia has a famous fund. Malaysia also has a very famous fund that now has brought down the previous prime minister, and the 1MDB fund is an example. So one of those funds too. But most of the time, okay, the people who invest are people who have a lot of patient money. So pensions, insurance companies, and endowment plan. Chulalongkorn University has about 50 billion baht of assets in endowment that needs to be managed. Sounds like a lot, but it's nothing compared to big universities like Harvard, MIT, or even NUS. At one point I heard, okay, National University of Singapore had a very beneficial donor. One of the alumnus got really successful and he donated a building in downtown to NUS worth 1.2 billion Singapore dollars. So that's more than 50% of our university endowment. And that's how most universities are run in the world, okay, private donations. So when you're successful, don't get our university, come back and give us money too, please. But mostly it's American universities that do this. Harvard University is well known for its own fund management. There's actually a private equity fund run by Harvard University. It's one of the most well known. I think the most well known is Yale University. Second one is Harvard. Their endowment management office are basically hedge funds that invest in everything that make money. And a lot of people got a career started from there. Okay. So I think you can skip a lot of these statistics. You can read them in your own time, I think. Now, if you want to invest in mutual funds, in private equity funds, if you're not a very wealthy individual, are you allowed to invest? Yes, you are. In the United States, you can invest in anything that you want because everything that you can imagine of are traded on the stock exchange. Here, an ETF, an exchange-traded fund. One of the features of exchange-traded fund is that it's basically an investment vehicle that the returns on this tracks some underlying price process. How they make that so, okay, is another topic altogether. You can think of exchange-traded funds as like a kind of structured product that trades on a stock exchange, and the returns of those funds track some underlying benchmark that the issuer says this is how the return of this fund is going to be. So there are funds that track the returns of private equity. So you buy those funds, you get the exposure to private equity investment. You can also invest in funds that are listed on the stock market themselves. That's also possible too. Oh, by the way, ETFs is fascinating. ETFs in Thailand, a lot of the trades are actually in the ETFs that are tracking the stock exchange, SET 50. You can also trade ETFs that track gold, ETFs that track oil. In the United States, there are ETFs that track the market in the opposite direction, and inverse ETF that when the market goes up, the portfolio value goes down, and vice versa. So you don't need to short the market. You don't need to have futures position. You just buy the reverse ETF, and then you have the negative exposure. There's also a levered ETF, like ETF 3X. So if the market goes up by 1%, your ETF goes up by 3%, and vice versa. So ETF is a very fascinating investment vehicle. A lot of people do research in this area too. But sadly, in Thailand, though, there's only a minimal amount of people who invest in ETFs. So we hope that changes over time, right? At least, you can try to go and look at your fund investment performance. I'm willing to bet that your fund performance is no better than the ETF performance. Yet the ETF fees are basis points, but your fund fees in Thailand is about, on average, 1.8% that you pay into fund managers to manage your funds. Thailand ranks as one of the, in this region, we rank almost at the top in terms of how much fees we charge to investors. So a bit of a tip that may make your money go a longer way. So here's an example of a fact sheet of the ETF that tracks private equity portfolio. So you can see the kind of information they propose. You can see this name and then go and look that up in your own time. You can also invest in the PE firms themselves if you would like, because some of these companies are listed in the stock exchange. So that means their performance, whatever they get, the profits that they get are going to be shared by the shareholders too. So here's an article that talk about investing in those private equity firms in the stock exchange as well. But the pros and cons. Okay, if you are a company that invests in the stock market, you are exposed to some of the external monitoring that you might not have welcomed otherwise, like we discussed earlier, right? If you IPO, then of course you get more exposure, you get more visibility and so on, but you have more eyes looking at you. And one of the things that you might want to avoid is that, hey, what kind of investment are you making? You might not want to be giving away your strategies to other people, because one of the important key competitive points of a fund manager is that, is your pipeline dry or not? Deal pipeline. You might look at 50 investment opportunities only to make investment in one. So if you have to review those pipelines, you're pretty screwed, because if other people know you're looking at those companies too, that's an opportunity to buy against you. So there are pros and cons, okay, about how this should be managed. Right, so how to create value? These are the 4 commonly stated reasons how private equity firms can create value and then capture that returns. Let's talk about the top 2 first. Okay, growth and free cash flow generation. They look similar, but not quite. If you recall our ROIC expansion earlier, right? You want to have a company that has high ROIC. So what can we do? Okay, we can rationalize our asset utilization so that we don't have as much capital tied up in our company. We can generate cash flow more quickly. That's a free cash flow generation improvement. So you go in and change the company process, change the company's operating strategy to unlock more of the cash tied up inside the company. You can go into the company and then change the way things are done, change business model, make introductions, use your contact, use your network to sell the product better. The growth opportunities that the current management don't know how to. Okay, one of the distinguished features between who are good PE firms is that what kind of network they have access to, who do they know, what kind of people they can bring on. So these involve turning around the way companies are done, okay, the operational changes. You might want to bring in experts who know how to run the company, because right now the company you just bought used to be a family business, not run by professional managers. So sometimes buyout firms target those family-owned companies and give them a lifeline to exit the investment and bring them under professional management, and that creates new opportunities. The bottom 2 though are a little more harder to palate. Leverage. One of the easiest way for you to create return for equity investment is to just not use a lot of equity. Buy the same asset, use a lot of debt to the extent that your borrowing cost isn't exorbitant, then you have a levered return. So your performance looks good. Remember all this preferred rate, preferred return you have to make. These are not risk-adjusted returns. These are absolute returns. So as long as you deliver the equity returns above the preferred rate, you get paid. So I can turn something that has an average return into something that has astronomical return just by using debt. And that's how they create quote-unquote value. They create a really high return. Now we know we should be evaluating the returns based on a risk-adjusted benchmark, but you know what? When you evaluate PE returns, you don't make any risk adjustment. It's all on a total return. So their playbook is to use leverage, because that's the way you can increase the return. And in that spreadsheet, if we get to see it in the LBO model, when you try to do it with your Cellplacer, you would see that regardless of the amount of debt you use, we don't account for any indirect costs of debt like financial distress at all in the model. There's only the benefit of debt where we have tax shield, okay, where we have levered returns. But any downside of debt that we may have talked about, they're not in the model. So if they're not in the model, then we're just turning one eye, closing one eye, and then only looking at using the eye we prefer. So that's one of the risks that investing in private equity funds have. So there have been a few academic researchers that tried to account for fund risk, and then what they found was that, well, it turns out when you invest in private equity funds, you're not really generating more returns, because on a risk-adjusted basis, it's pretty much the same as a market return. So, you're not really making additional value by doing this. Another name is multiple expansion, and this is a fancy name for buying low, selling high. Because multiple expansion means I buy at 5x EBITDA and I sell at 7x EBITDA. That's it. That's how I make money, because I was able to time the purchase. I was able to squeeze the purchase. Maybe the person I bought from was a guy who really wanted to exit the business. So he was willing to sell to me at a quite an okay price. And when I go out and find the buyers, I find more willing buyers. I have more time, I have more network, I have more connection. So think of it as like flipping a home. Okay, you buy a condo, you buy a townhouse that is quite run down. You come in and you redecorate it, and then you go and sell it. You don't really have any intention of owning that condo in the first place. You just want to make the most money out of it. So that's, all in all, how you're making money. Private equity business model is a lot like flipping a house, flipping a condo. You want to buy low, you want to redecorate it, and you want to sell high. And most importantly, okay, you want to time the market so that you can make money as well. But one of the most common arguments, okay, that PE companies have used in favor actually came from the paper you guys all know about and very fond of, Michael Jensen's free cash flow hypothesis. When a company has lots of free cash flow, we tend to waste the cash flow. So when the company is operated under extreme stress, also with a lot of debt obligation, number one, you waste less, and number two, you become a lot more creative. So when companies are operating under a lot of leverage, you can actually squeeze out a lot of efficiency out of the company. So that's what the PE firms say. Sometimes they will even bring in CEOs who specialize in managing companies under high leverage, like a special CEO, like guns for high, who know how to cut costs, okay, who know how to turn things around. There are even people who are hired to come in and bankrupt the company. You know what's good about bankrupted company? A bankrupted company can discharge their pension obligation. One of the most important liabilities a company may have is pension obligation. But when it's bankrupt, sometimes bankruptcy court says, well, we can't afford to pay this, right? So let's cut it a little bit. So there have been cases where companies do this. And private companies can do this because when you're a private company, you're not in the stock market anymore. When you're not in the stock market, you don't have to tell anyone anything what you're doing. So you can go and take the company off the market, go behind the scene, do some really, really ugly things to the company in the name of making the companies better, then come back, list in the stock market again. There are many, many cases of companies that were taken private for like 6 to 8 months, then they come back again a lot more efficient because they went back and do all those ungodly things out of sight. So that involved things like filing for bankruptcy to discharge all these pension liabilities, or these include things like breaking up the union in the company. So when you don't have unionized labor anymore, the bargaining power goes down, so you can reduce costs more easily. So as you can understand, private equity, especially buyout companies, don't really have a very good reputation. There was one point, okay, when President Obama was up for the second re-election in 2008. He was up against, 2012. He was up against Mitt Romney. Okay, Mitt Romney, a Republican candidate. Mitt Romney actually worked for Bain Capital. The same Bain as a consulting company. There's a private equity arm of that company. And he was involved with some of the deals that were associated with these transactions that created value for the company, but ended up hurting other stakeholders like employees and so on. So the Obama camp actually used that a lot against Mitt Romney. He's one of those guys who earn a lot of money, and they actually attack the carried interest part, because as we talked about earlier, carried interest is a vehicle used by the rich people to avoid paying high taxes. Otherwise, there's no reason for you to structure that as a partnership at all. The partnership is there to change ordinary income into carried interest income, which is capital gains, taxed at 20% as opposed to 30-40% that you would have paid had you been paid as salary instead. And partly they said because of that, okay, Obama won again. Of course, there are other factors, but one of the Achilles heel of Mitt Romney was that he worked for a private equity company. So I'll send you guys a few links about how private equity companies have left the real economy's damage as well. People talk about retail apocalypse in the United States. We've seen a lot of that in Singapore and maybe coming in Thailand too. That refers to a situation where we have a lot of malls and shops that are being shut off because no customers go there anymore. People blame Amazon, online shopping, so that people don't go to these malls and shop. But the real breaking point, why those retailers are bankrupt, because most of these retailers who are bankrupt, they're actually owned by private equity companies. And when you're owned by private equity companies, you have a lot of debt. If you have a lot of debt and you suffer a small decline in operating performance, you can't make your debt payment anymore. So you're screwed, you're bankrupt. If you weren't owned by private equity companies, your leverage may not be as high. Your performance may be bad, but not bad enough to put you out of business. But when you have leverage like this, you are now walking on a razor. You slip off, you're dead. So any small shocks, any small disruptions to business as usual can actually put you out of business. And there have been cases where whole towns are put out of business because the company was owned by a private equity firm and then the company became bankrupt, but that company was a major employer of that town. So the whole town basically became a ghost town because of the failure of one company. So it's got its fair share, of criticisms, but there are also other camps who say, well, private equity companies act as a way to increase efficiency in capital allocation. Because they were doing the job of disciplining companies. If you're poorly managed, I'm going to come in and take the company away from you, change the way it's run, so that capital is allocated more efficiently. Academic research is still open-end on this, whether private equity, especially buyouts, is a good thing or not. But that remains to be seen. But as the number suggests, it's still a very popular business. So there's a few other things that we could talk about, but let me reserve them to talk about in the future instead, I think. Returns and so on, and also some papers associated with the idea. So I want to finish the class by talking to you about the case study Toys R Us. This case, unlike other cases, you're not really asked to model the stuff out anymore because the spreadsheet and now on Blackboard has been provided to you and it's an LBO model. So I want you instead to try to crack the spreadsheet, see how it is used. It's one of the more advanced models that allows you to put in multiple scenarios. So you put in, I want to do scenario 1, and the sheet updates to scenario 1 automatically for you. You put in, I want scenario 2, the whole sheet updates to scenario 2. So it's a very good learning point in terms of the Excel modeling exercise. So what I want you to do is take this, use the model template and develop an argument. We call this an investment thesis, and like PowerPoint slides that either support the acquisition of Toys R Us or decline the acquisition. The case also gives you some background about how private equity deals are done. Sometimes a deal comes as a syndicate, and many private equity firms come in together, join force to go and buy this company together. So we have a case where we have a few companies, KKR, Bain, and Bordano, approaching this company, and you are another one in the consortium who is going in. So every assumption has been given in terms of financing and so on, don't change them. Just take them as it is. I want this to be more of a case of exploring the financial model that's been given to you and how private equity modeling is a little different from valuation modeling that we've done together in class. And prepare an investment thesis, a PowerPoint deck, don't need to write any report. And then you can submit the PowerPoint